Something I've been working on for a long time now is a concept I describe as mythquake. We depend a lot on assumptions, and when those assumptions are unexamined, untested or unverified, it's what we might call a myth. Now when that kind of myth collides with the reality department, what we get is what we might call a mythquake. And yes, there's a straight analogy there with an earthquake. There's tension built up that when it releases, there's a kind of explosion. Now in earthquakes we have two pretty much exponential scales, one of which is Richter, which most people know, which is a measure of the energy of an earthquake. And in principle there's only one given Richter measure for any given earthquake. And the Mercalli scale, which is a measure of impact, and by definition we have an almost infinite number of Mercalli references for any given earthquake. So in a mythquake we can measure in terms of the scale of impact, in terms of the number of people who undergo or are faced with life-changing events from the respective mythquake. We can put it in powers of 10, where 10 to the 0 is one person affected in a life-changing way, all the way up to 10 to the 9.7, which we might consider to be an extinction level event, an extinction level mythquake. Some people suggested I ought to name this scale after myself, call it a grave scale, but unfortunately it's a bit too literal. So let's just call it MQ scale, a mythquake scale. Now mythquakes can be positive too. For example, a wedding, getting married, is a mythquake. The assumption that I am alone is no longer true. There are all sorts of things that are changing. Having a child born is a mythquake in its own. It changes a lot of our assumptions in a very real way. So these can be very positive as well. But in this case I'm looking at it particularly in terms of the life-changing is more of a challenge, particularly because when we refuse to look at the potential for a mythquake, the tension increases. So that quite often politics can affect 1,000 lives, 10,000 lives. That puts us in the range straight away of mythquake 4 to 5. But when we start mixing things like gender into it, or race, issues which most people are trying to avoid or ignore, then the potential can easily rise to the point where it affects millions, tens of millions, even hundreds of millions of people. That puts us right up in a mythquake 7 or 8, which by the fact of ignoring it means that we've ended up with a much greater mythquake than we previously would have done. So there are very real risks that arise from denying or refusing to face the potential for a mythquake. A very real example which we're dealing with right now is about all the myths about just-in-time logistics and globalized supply chains. Everything's fine as long as everything can move unchallenged easily across the world. When suddenly that isn't the case, a lot of our supply chains are breaking down, which itself exacerbates the risk because it's now affecting millions of people and tens of millions of people rather than just being a local event. So mythquakes, what we need to do is a whole bunch of things. We need to look at mythquake risk and opportunity. We need to identify what those are, because even within each one of those, from an architecture perspective, there will be elements of that that are relatively predictable, including often the probability of the mythquake itself. We can certainly see how elements of a myth might be exacerbated by people refusing to look at it and thus increase the risk that's involved. Another one is to be prepared for mythquakes. We've got to be ready for them, practice them, even in small things, just everyday upsets, like in my case being stuck in a hotel room for 14 days because of quarantine rules. How do I adapt to that? Well, by getting ready on the small things, the same methods apply in the large ones. We're looking at risk mitigation, the mythquake mitigation, and also adaptation when it gets more extreme, which is risk reduction, but as I say, adaptation means for changing for things for which we cannot reduce the risk. There's also mythquake recovery, where we need to be looking at how we're dealing with and how we resolve the disruption that a mythquake will cause, even at the small scale all the way through to the large ones. One of the ways we do that is particularly by focusing on what the opportunities are for constructive change arising from that mythquake. And also mythquake response in real time, how we handle the mythquake at the time. So that's things like triage, which I'm doing right now with things like escrow and so on, working out what I can do in a hurry, or what are the most urgent sequence of things that I do in case I no longer be able to work. And also things like guidance principles. What are the choices? For example, how does this action help everyone rather than only help me? So these are things that a mythquake can help us understand. But a mythquake is going to occur whenever an unexamined, untested or unverified assumption collides with reality department, often in some major way. So mythquake is a useful concept to explore. That's what I'm hoping to develop more as time goes on.